As we're wrapping up this first season of the Fantasy Football for Winners podcast, it will end this coming Monday. Just a look at this week. On Tuesday, I focused on top 30 preseason based on average draft position, fantasy quarterbacks. What happened? Where were the busts? Where were the bargains? And what trends do we see, especially based on historical data? That was compounded on Wednesday, yesterday, with running backs. Major trends. Things that were easily predictable from my perspective, and things that were, from my perspective, not easily predictable, but maybe you predicted. Great job for you. But things that we can learn going into 2026. Today, wide receivers. I'm going to walk through the top 30 preseason, again, based on average draft position, wide receivers. What happened? What can we learn? And apply it towards 2026. Next year. Can't believe it. 2026. It's here. If you're listening to this, it's now here. Starting off, Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, Malik Neighbors, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Those were the top 5 in terms of preseason average draft position. Jamar Chase, I did a whole blog post on September 1st. I remember because it was one of the most highest engagement blog posts I'd ever done in all these years. And it was Jamar Chase and why I was drafting him as the WR1, but why I didn't think he was a good bet to finish as the WR1, because every year, pretty much, the previous season's WR1 in terms of fantasy points is the preseason ADP WR1, and they don't generally repeat. You have to go back to Antonio Brown in those days to kind of get that consistent dominance. But there's always a reason, whether it's CeeDee Lamb or whether it's Justin Jefferson or whoever else, there's a letdown that occurs. Jamar Chase, there was a letdown. It wasn't his fault. It was, Joe Burrow getting hurt. But even when Joe Burrow was back, Jamar Chase was not the same dominant self. T. Higgins was actually last year what was he? WR6 in fantasy points per game or something like that. It was incredible. That's why I traded for him this season when his stock couldn't have been lower. Traded Patrick Mahomes at his peak value for T. Higgins at his lowest value and Jackson Dart. It worked out, even though Higgins got hurt, Dart got hurt. Still, on balance, I'm glad I did it. It just stinks that those guys got hurt. But the point is, Jamar Chase, as pick him with the second, third overall pick, you had to understand that he was a better bet for 300 points than 400 points. And that's kind of the takeaway, looking ahead to next year when maybe Puka Nacua will not be the number 1. The 2 through 5 CeeDee Lamb, big question marks. I talked about this on the podcast, many weeks ago. Why do we consider CeeDee Lamb to be the number 1 wide receiver in Dallas? And then weeks later, another podcast episode explaining that George Pickens had been just as good or better in fantasy points per game since CeeDee Lamb had returned from his injury. Fascinating. Jefferson, it was all about bad quarterback play. A lot of hype around J.J. McCarthy. The hype did not match the actual performance until late in the season, and even then it was too late. Malik Neighbors gets hurt. What can you do? And Amon-Ra St. Brown, one of the most consistent, dominant receivers of the last 15 years. Every year, he is seemingly money to be a weekly must-start wide receiver and to be healthy. That's hard to do. 6 through 10, Puka Nacua, Nico Collins, Brian Thomas, A.J. Brown, Drake London. Fascinating group. Nacua and London look like the big winners. London gets hurt and fades to the background. But in principle, you had Nacua and London. Even though London had a subpar quarterback situation, he was far and away the number 1 receiver, and that's how he benefited. With Nacua, he had to compete with Devontae Adams for most of the season, but still dominated. That says a lot. For the other 3, what can you say about Brian Thomas that hasn't already been said? So not much. For Nico Collins, really interesting. I'll put it that way. On the one hand, Nico Collins is the WR11 in fantasy points per game, which isn't that bad when you think about it. He's wedged between CeeDee Lamb and A.J. Brown. On the other hand, that Houston offense just didn't quite click. And you felt like there were points left off the table, that Collins could have been so much more. And it will be fascinating to see how Collins does next year in terms of his ADP, because if his ADP drops a little bit, it actually could be a buying opportunity. He's still reliable as the alpha receiver on that team. It's just a matter of, can CJ Stroud and him be on the same page and be in a position where Stroud is elevated and Collins is at his peak, which is top 5. And finally, Brown struggled and struggled and struggled and finally came through. He was one of those guys that you just hold off and wait. I got some questions on A.J. Brown throughout the first half of the season. What do I do? My answer generally was the same, which is if you need points now, I get it, trade him away. But I'd rather bet on Brown coming through by the time the season's over. The key for that was, and I talked about this on a podcast episode, I believe. If not, I talked about it on the blog. At one point, he was on pace for about 650 receiving yards. And I wrote or talked about how it was inconceivable that Brown was going to finish the season with 650 receiving yards. Just made no sense. That's not, that will not be permitted in a Philadelphia offense. At some point, he will get going. There is a law of averages that exists. And if you have been left, out, if you've been pushed aside in the offense, or if defenses have locked you down, then offensive coordinator figures out how to get you more involved in the offense. And sure enough, that's what happened with Brown. He has over 1,000 receiving yards. There you go. 11 through 15. We've got Ladd McConkey, T. Higgins, Tyreek Hill, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Terry McLaurin. Now, Tyreek Hill injured early, so push him aside. T. Higgins, valued about right for what he was. His overall ADP was about the same as Lamar Jackson's. T. Higgins was amazing last season when he was healthy. The issue with Higgins is health. You take the good with the bad. He's not always going to be on the field. When he is, he can be a 30-point guy. Terry McLaurin, everything had to go right for him last year to dominate. Same thing with Jaden Daniels. And once Daniels got hurt and or didn't look as good as he had looked last year, and once Terry McLaurin started having health issues, it all fell apart for obvious reasons. I am curious whether McLaurin will get back to being a top 20 wide receiver at his age 30 or 31 season, whatever he'll be next year. Time's running out for McLaurin to be a weekly fantasy starter. I left out the other two. Ladd McConkey intentionally, because they're a tale of two receivers. I had Jackson Smith and Jigba ranked well ahead of Ladd McConkey, even though McConkey had a better ADP. I spent several podcast episodes talking about both. I do not want to belabor it, but just to say it was clear as day to me that McConkey was vastly overvalued. You can go back to some old Chargers podcast episodes from August and September to learn why. For Jackson Smith and Jigba, it made no sense that he was ranked outside the top 12. And if I had had the guts, I would have ranked him even higher. One of my podcast episodes talked about how he could be the number one overall fantasy receiver this year. And this was back in the preseason, that the ingredients were there for him to dominate. The question was going to be, how good was Cooper Kupp going to be playing alongside him? And how good was Sam Darnold going to be playing on his, third new team in 3 seasons? Receivers 16 through 20. Mike Evans, Devontae Adams, Garrett Wilson, Marvin Harrison Jr., DJ Moore. Fascinating group. I was very down on Evans this year. I felt that he just barely got 1,000 yards last year, and it was largely because Chris Godwin got hurt, and now you have a rookie in Emeka Egbuka. I was very down on Evans, even if he hadn't gotten hurt. I think he would have underperformed expectations with everyone else healthy. The reality is Evans did about as well as he could do given the circumstances. But he was, at his advancing age, crowded receiving core, it's tough for him to be a weekly starter. Adams dominated. Didn't see that coming. Some of you probably did. And I can't believe the Jets let him walk. Insert your punchline, there. Garrett Wilson, I thought, speaking of the Jets, I thought would be fine. I thought he would get enough targets. Even when he was healthy, he was not fine. And then he gets hurt, and the writing was on the wall at that point that on a flailing team, they weren't going to rush him back. Now, in fairness, I will say this with Garrett Wilson. He did have 4 great performances, and he had 2 miserable performances. And then in his last game, I think he got hurt during the game, whatever it was, he got 0 fantasy points. But the point is, when you get Garrett Wilson, you want him to be a weekly starter. Yes, he was great 4 of those weeks, but the 2 weeks he wasn't, he was unstartable. That's not what you expect from a guy like Garrett Wilson. Marvin Harrison Jr., I completely whiffed on him. I drafted him. I thought he had a chance to be a breakout receiver, kind of like Malik Nabers last year. Didn't happen. And the irony, and I think I'm using the word irony correctly here, is that when he gets hurt and Michael Wilson steps up with Jacoby Brissett, Wilson looks like what I thought Harrison was going to look like. And then Harrison comes back. He's not entirely healthy. Maybe he is. Who knows? But Wilson is still dominating. Keep an eye on ADPs next year. Whether Michael Wilson is ahead of Harrison in average draft position. On the one hand, it seems obvious that he would be. On the other hand, it would seem bizarre in some ways for someone like a former first-round pick in Harrison, still very young, kind of like Wilson, to just be pushed aside as the number 2 receiver in Arizona. But the market is going to be all over the place, I think, on this, and it might not be settled until we get into late August, early September. And finally, DJ Moore, talked about him a bunch starting last year. That last year he was playing with the most crowded receiving core of his career. He was used to being the clear-cut alpha. Last season, he was no longer the clear-cut alpha. What would happen to a receiver who's no longer the clear-cut alpha? And what happened was, even though his targets went up, his production went down. He was more of a short yardage guy. He wasn't in those high leverage situations as much. His everything went down across the board. This year, it was exacerbated by an even more crowded receiving core, even though Caleb Williams took a step forward. That is a huge concern. If you DJ Moore in Dynasty, all you can do is just sit and wait and hope maybe he gets traded to another team where he can maybe end his career as a number 1 or strong number 2. But right now, it looks like, his ADP next year is probably going to be 30 or worse in that receiving core. If it isn't, he's a huge, huge fade. 21 through 25. DK Metcalf, Cortland Sutton, Xavier Worthy, Devontae Smith, Tetaroa McMillan. Really interesting group. Metcalf is just one of those strange cases. I talked about this a few years ago with Aaron Rodgers. He always has a clear-cut number 1. And he leans heavily into the number 1, and he over-targets the number 1. This is the first year that I can remember where it really didn't happen that way. I mean, Metcalf was targeted. He has about almost 100 targets this year. But this was a tight end heavy, running back heavy offense. Metcalf was hit or miss. Aaron Rodgers, in his advancing age, conservative game calling, whatever it is, was not worth what people invested, even though he finished just about at his ADP. Cortland Sutton was the big winner. Did not see that coming. He's the WR16 in fantasy points per game, compared to a 22 ADP, and his performance is actually justified starting him every week. That his upside was so good, pretty consistently in an offense where there were no other reliable wide receivers. Sutton really came through for fantasy managers who didn't have to invest a lot to get him. Xavier Worthy was one of the biggest busts. I've talked about this, the oddity, but it's not that odd, that when Rashee Rice is on the field, Worthy doesn't score. And when Rice is not on the field, Worthy has something like a 50% chance of scoring based on his history. So it's just one of those weird things when you factor in, Patrick Mahomes getting hurt, and it's game over. Devontae Smith, I can't explain it. I thought Devontae Smith would be much better. He wasn't. I thought Tetaroa McMillan would be solid. He was only barely solid. And he disappeared at times. That is a big concern when you've got a number 1 wide receiver who's the WR25 and he barely finishes in the top 25 in scoring. That's a concern. Maybe that passing attack will turn things around next year. Finally, 26 through 30, we've got Zay Flowers, Jameson Williams, Calvin Ridley, George Pickens, Travis Hunter. It is basically, you couldn't get more diverse in terms of the outcomes of these players. Flowers was solid. That's the best you can say about Flowers. He's just barely inside the top 20 in fantasy points per game. Jameson Williams was hit or miss. He's only 2 spots behind, but I think most people would have preferred to have Jameson Williams. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but Jameson Williams had some big games when it mattered most, and his touchdowns allowed for a higher ceiling. I'll put it that way. Calvin Ridley, invisible, playing with his fifth quarterback in 5 years. He's still kind of the legend of Ridley is what happened many years ago, and people are still drafting him based on that legend rather than the reality. Travis Hunter getting hurt early after his one big game. He'll be that whole Jacksonville receiving core will be fascinating to value next summer. When you have Thomas, you have Ridley, you have potentially Jacoby Myers and Parker Washington. If Parker Washington is helping people win their titles, and I know for a fact he helped one of you because you told me that he was instrumental in helping you win your title, and Parker Washington was supposed to be the number 4, number 5 receiver, that says a lot about how messed up this fantasy dynamic is in the best and worst ways. And finally, Pickens, what can be said? I've talked about him a bunch, and we have to understand the fact that for the first time in several years, CeeDee Lamb had a true rival for the number 1 wide receiver role. Not since Amari Cooper several years ago has CeeDee Lamb had that kind of challenge. And we see what happens. Even in a somewhat top-heavy receiving core, Pickens went toe-to-toe. And going into next year, I don't know. I think CeeDee Lamb is going to be ranked ahead of Pickens, but as I talked about in a recent podcast, whichever one is ranked ahead of the other, pick the one who's ranked lower, because it's a 50-50 chance that you're going to be right, and you're expending less fantasy capital, less draft capital, getting the quote-unquote worst receiver of those two. But it's probably going to be Pickens, assuming that he's back in Dallas, because CeeDee Lamb still has that aura of invincibility, of eliteness, and I don't think that holds water when you've got a guy like Pickens on the field. Very quickly, outside of the top 30, just in terms of notable names, Jalen Waddle, 31, such a low ceiling, such a disappointment. Rashee Rice at 32, such a high ceiling. The question is he going to put it all together for a full season? Rome Odunze at 34, the number 1, and then no longer the number 1. Instead, rookie Luther Burden, who was the WR62, was the big guy to get in that receiving core. Incredible. I will mention again the Chargers with Ladd McConkey. I talked about this on an early podcast. The preseason ADP had Keenan Allen, Quentin Johnston, and Trey Harris all outside the top 50. Johnston was around 70. Keenan Allen was like 55. Trey Harris was around 70 also. And my point was, in a Justin Herbert-led offense, there is no conceivable way that only one Chargers wide receiver is going to finish in the top 50. Even though that passing attack struggled, we can still look at, those of you who invest in Keenan Allen, right now you have the WR41 in fantasy points per game. Those who invested in Quentin Johnston have the WR28 in fantasy points per game. Ladd McConkey is 37th. There you go. It was easy pickings if you just understood the fact that a Justin Herbert-led offense should be able to support at least 2 top 50 wide receivers. You had an almost automatic bargain between Keenan Allen and Quentin Johnston. And all you had to do was pick both at the very end of your draft, and you would have gotten something for next to nothing. I'm BJ Riddell, Fantasy Football for Winners. Follow me on the blog. Email me anytime. We'll see you tomorrow.